or delay an appointment of habeas counsel. That is 17, 18 years of delay where absolutely nothing is happening for these inmates, and it doesn't help the inmates either to sit and wait for an attorney and not have anyone hearing their claims. And eliminating that delay alone cuts the time for appeal in half without eliminating any due process. How do you pay for those lawyers, you might ask? This is one we stole directly from Prop 34. We got rid of the special housing on death row. This eliminates special housing on death row. Right now, by state law, condemned inmates are required to be housed at San Quentin, which is an old and archaic facility that is far more expensive to run. And they do also get special privileges. They get private housing, they get special privileges, they don't have to work, they don't have to pay restitution. Prop 66 would eliminate special housing, allow them to be housed with general population, assuming they're safe enough to do so, and many of them are, like Scott Peterson. It would make them work and pay restitution to their victims, the families of their murder victims. And the state legislature has estimated that that provision alone will save tens of millions of dollars annually. This proposition has a lot of fine points. Like I said, it's very technical. It's based on a lot of legal analysis. But what it comes down to is the facts of these cases. At the end of the day, your decision has to be made on whether or not you think there should be a death penalty. Because if there should, then we need to fix it. And this legislation does fix it. The death penalty right now is applied to child killers. It's applied to cop killers. It's applied to serial killers. And we have some of the worst serial killers in history on California's death row. Charles Ng, who's just a terrible individual responsible for dozens of deaths. Lawrence Bittaker, the toolbox killer, who kidnapped, raped, and tortured teenage girls. And then we have the child killers, the worst of the worst, like the people who kidnapped Polly Klaas. Like the kidnappers of Polly Klaas, who kidnapped her from her home, tortured and raped her. The individual who kidnapped 8-year-old Michael Lyons as he walked home from school and inflicted over 70 shallow stab wounds while sodomizing Michael before they slit his throat and dumped him in a ditch by the river. Like Vincent Benavides, who sodomized an infant to death. These are not your average killers. These are the worst of the worst, and there has to be an ultimate penalty, particularly for those who kill from prison and in prison. There needs to be a penalty for someone who's already serving a life sentence, who orders witnesses killed from prison, and who kills prison guards. And we, after Prop 34, we made a promise to the voters that we would fix this system and make it work, and this initiative can make it work. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's try to break through these microphone challenges and get into a spirited debate. So let me ask you, Michelle, since 1931, 156 people have been exonerated from their place on death row. There was an acquittal, they were granted a pardon on evidence of evidence, there was a dismissal of charges. How can we be sure? I mean, there's some terrible, terrible stories, several of which you just mentioned. But wouldn't it be a terrible thing for the state to do to put an innocent person to death?
Well, it would be a terrible thing, but there's no indication that that has ever happened or is likely to happen in California. You can't compare us to...
Why on this microphone are actually up? Okay. So we're going to go ahead and explain the process now.
Okay, so we turn this on?
California has one of the most thorough review processes anywhere, and there's absolutely no indication, and even our governor agrees, that there has been any innocent person on death row in California. The death penalty opponents like to trot out what they call exonerations, including the 3 Mr. Garcetti cited too. But the fact of the matter is those convictions were overturned on technical grounds. And then if those individuals are retried 20 years later when the witnesses are dead and gone, perhaps they can't be convicted. But that doesn't mean that they weren't appropriately convicted in the first place. No winning. What you have to remember is that the death penalty is not imposed by police, it's not imposed by prosecutors, and it's not imposed by judges. It's also not imposed by people who watched a 30-second clip on the news a couple of days a week about the case. It's imposed by jurors who sat day after day, all day in a courtroom and listened to the evidence. Juries from our communities. So they're the only ones who can impose death, and they're the only ones who do. And then when these inmates get a review to the state Supreme Court, to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and to the United States Supreme Court, with some of the very smartest judges in our country, I don't think it's fair to suggest that they are not given every opportunity to challenge their conviction.
Mr. Garcetti, you said that putting the murderer of a victim of a family members does not bring closure to the family. With respect, who are you to say that that doesn't bring them closure? And if that's really the core question, should we not let the victims' families play a role in deciding whether or not they want the convicted murderer to be put to death or not?
Well, luckily, I've never been in a position where I was a family member in that kind of situation. But you can talk to some. In my first, I think the first case that I recall where things changed was when I was first elected district attorney. We had a case involving two police officers that were killed by one individual. They stopped the car and he literally shot and killed both individuals. The mother of one of the officers pleaded with us to seek the death penalty, And then she changed her opinion. And the reason she changed is that because the death penalty, if this man ever gets the death penalty, it's too easy for him. I want him to remember every day he is not going to get out of prison, and that he is going to be in this 6-foot by 8-foot cell with another individual because he killed my son. Now that is punishment, in my view, she said. So you're right. You know, I'm not there, but you can talk to others. I've talked with the wardens who've been there, who've talked to people. There are so many who are conflicted with this, some who definitely want the death penalty, and they think that's going to solve it. There is one individual, God, I'm sorry, I don't recall the name, who the killer of his son was executed, and he is quoted as saying, "I don't feel any different. This hasn't helped me at all," and I thought it would.
You made the case earlier that the fact that we provide these extra, quote-unquote, perks for folks on death row takes away from the impact of the death penalty, perhaps, or it's another argument that you use to argue for a repeal. Ms. Hennessy, of course, will say, well, shoot, vote for Prop 66, and it will take away that extra perk, and it will speed up the process, it will lower the costs, and address the core logistical concerns that you raised earlier about the death penalty.
I've read 66. It is one of the more convoluted, complex, and ambiguous propositions I've ever read. With due respect to Michelle, she probably didn't have that much to do with it. It would have been much clearer. But regardless, in this situation with 66, this proposition would require any lawyer who has been certified by the Court of Appeal to handle their cases now to require them to handle death penalty appeals, or else they can't handle any other cases. Doesn't make any difference whether they're trained or not, or they're capable or not. Do you realize that over 50% of all death penalty cases in the United States are reversed at some point, either by the state courts or by the federal courts? This is man-made for that. That's what's going to happen. You would have reversals, you're going to have continuation of long appeals. 66 doesn't serve any purpose. Where is the money going to come from to pay for these extra lawyers, for the extra judges, for the jails that have to be built in LA County or any other county where we're going to house our own people that we sentence to death? Where does that money come from? They tried this in the legislature, a bipartisan group with the then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. They did fact-finding, said this is how we can speed up the system. Not one Republican, not one Democrat ever submitted a bill implementing any part of what their proposal was. That's what 66 is trying to do again, but it doesn't say how it's going to be paid for.
Sure. I'm sure Michelle has a response.
Of course I do. And it's beautifully written. I don't know what you're talking about. This is one of the sections the opponents like to attack. They say, oh, they're going to make these unqualified lawyers handle these appeals, and that's completely untrue. And if you actually read the language, what it says is, when necessary to remove a substantial backlog in appointment of counsel, so only when necessary to remove a substantial backlog, the Supreme Court shall require attorneys who are qualified for appointment, to the most serious non-capital appeals and who meet the qualifications for capital appeals to accept appointment. The language specifically says they must otherwise be qualified. So let me explain how it works now. I work for you. I am a public servant. I get paid with your taxpayer dollars. When I go to work and my boss says, hey, Michelle, we want you to try this case. It's kind of difficult. It's going to be a lot of work. I don't get to say, no, thank you. I only want to do the easy cases. But that's what the state is letting their panel attorneys do. They're letting them pick and choose to do the easier cases and not take the bigger cases that are going to take a longer amount of time and more work. And I, as a taxpayer and a public servant, find that offensive. If you're going to take taxpayer dollars, you better be ready to do all the work, including the hard work. And all this says is if you want to take taxpayer money to take state appeals, you have to take all the appeals.
Let me ask you a question that builds upon what Gil mentioned before. What do we ultimately gain out of this? What's the societal gain associated with a robust death penalty? It doesn't bring these victims back.
I think if you ask any of us who have been working with these cases for a long time, the one-word answer is justice. Like I said, if you're opposed to the death penalty on moral grounds, you're never going to believe that, and I respect that opinion. But at the end of the day, there are crimes so heinous, so awful, you will never hear in the news how bad they are because you can't say in the news how bad they are. I mentioned a few of the concepts to you. Mr. Vincent Benavides sodomized an infant to death. Charles Ng tortured and raped women in front of their husbands and children before he killed them all and fed their bodies to his pigs. Lawrence Bittaker, the toolbox killer, kidnapped teenage girls, wrapped wire around their throats. He tape recorded their tortured screams while he raped and tortured them with tools. It's a visceral response. There are some crimes that are unforgivable. There are some crimes that are so bad that death is the appropriate penalty, especially if you're already serving a life sentence or already convicted of such a crime and continue to kill. And I've put 3 people on death row now. And every one of them, I tell you, was guilty of multiple murders, and the one thing they had in common, they enjoyed killing. They bragged about it, and they laughed about it. And that is the sad truth about these individuals who are the incredible minority, but are very deserving of this penalty.
What about the issue that the courts have really raised concerns about over the years, that if you're a black man convicted of killing a white man, you're so much more likely to get the death penalty than if you're a black man convicted of murdering a black man. There are some serious racial disparity concerns, particularly in some other states, but certainly here as well. Doesn't that raise concerns for you?
Pause for helicopter. It doesn't raise concerns. Again, in California, there was that study, and again, most of the studies are conducted by death penalty opponents, so you have to question their fairness. This was not a judicial finding. This was not a court finding. This was a study by an organization, and it was a study done nationwide across the entire country. It was not based on California. If you look at California's death row, and the Department of Corrections puts their statistic online, you can go look up every single person on death row and what race they are and what age they are and all of that. You'll see that on average there are an equal number of whites and African Americans on death row, and a much smaller percentage of Hispanics and extremely low percentage of Asians in what they call other. So if you compare that to state population, it is disparate, but not necessarily racially unfair if you compare it to our sort of state demographics, which belies the suggestion that it is racially unfair. And I also think it's grossly unfair not to look at the race of the victims. And one thing you most consistently see is killers, especially repeat killers, tend to kill in race. For example, the Grim Sleeper, who was recently convicted and sentenced to death in Los Angeles, killed, I believe, 13 African American women here in Los Angeles.
Michelle just referred to the statistics from the California Department of Corrections. Let me give it to you. They have 272 black men or women on California's death row, and that amounts to a total of 36.32% of all the people on death row, yet the black population in the state of California is 6.5%. Now that's not out of proportion? Yeah, I think it is. I also have to go back to what Michelle and even the ads talk about. They continue to tell about all the cases in California, not just Los Angeles, but all the cases in California, that are truly horrific. I am not morally opposed to the death penalty. I'm pragmatic about it. Now, let me give you some other information. This is Los Angeles County alone. Between 2005 and 2013, there were 57 death verdicts. 2 cases involving the death of a police officer. 3 cases involving the death of a minor. We don't ever talk about the rest of those cases. What happened to the other 52 cases? What kind of cases were those? They didn't involve the kind of horrific cases Michelle talks about, that I've seen, that you've seen, that others have seen. And that's what bothers me. And do you know it also makes a difference right here in the county of Los Angeles where you try the case, whether you're going to get a death penalty or not, in my opinion? Go up and down the state and take a look at one county, how they impose the death penalty completely different than how Los Angeles County. I said, I support it. And I think that Los Angeles County does the job the way they're supposed to do in terms of making decisions on when to seek the death penalty. I can't say that about other counties, and when you look at the statistics on other counties, you'd be aghast. It's not the way they portray it, that these are all horrific killers, sodomizers, child abusers, rapists, multi-killers. Not the case.
You've both made some interesting comments about, and it does seem to come down to this moral question. You brought up the issue of this mother who changed her mind about the victim, about the murder of her child, of her son, and she said, "Well, it's better for him to be locked up forever, thinking about this murder." What do you say to that, Michelle? I mean, maybe ultimately maybe it's a better penalty. Maybe it's truer justice to have somebody locked up for life without the possibility of parole, thinking about what they did every single day, while also, keeping alive the possibility that if there ever is exonerating evidence, they could get out, and also saving all the money associated with due process. I understand that Prop 66 does seek to streamline the process, but surely, and we all know that there are lots of constitutional protections and procedures that we would never want to take away, so as to ensure the rigor and the integrity of the process. So maybe ultimately it's you don't get enough justice, and there's justice associated with life without the possibility of parole, and it's incredibly costly. What would you say to that?